Here we go. Okay, so before we kind of get started with the main body of the presentation, I wanted to let you know that SCVO's HR service team are facilitating today's session. And I just wanted to take a quick opportunity to introduce ourselves and the service. I know that many of you are already subscribed to the HR service, so it's really nice to see familiar faces and new faces with us today. SCVO's HR service supports employers across the voluntary sector in Scotland with all things HR, including absence, performance issues, conducting policy reviews, conflict resolution, but by no means is this an exhaustive list. I'm going to quickly ask Caroline and Amy to introduce themselves, but also we have Benita with us today, who also is part of the HR team, but she works primarily with the internal HR at SCVO. Caroline.
Hi everyone, I'm Caroline and I'm the head of HR at SCVO. Nice to see everyone.
And hi, I'm Amy Graham. I'm the HR Service Officer at SCVO, and nice to see everyone as well.
And I'm Lorna, HR Service Advisor, and I've been with SCVO for pretty much bang on 4 years now. As you'll see, our email address is in the slide, as you can see. So if you'd like to follow up on something regarding the service or something from today's session, please use this email address and one of us will get back to you as soon as we can. So moving on to the agenda. So today's agenda it will take us through the reasons why we've selected this topic to talk about, as well as the basics of absence management, how to effectively implement your absence policy, answer some questions about dealing with the nuances of absence management, thinking about proactive and reactive ways to support staff who are off or returning from time off. We'll also give a brief employment law update, including information on preventing sexual harassment at work and the newly proposed employment rights bill that you might have heard about in the news. With what time we've got left, we'll have a Q&A before closing the session at 11 a.m. So first up, the context. And I just really wanted to set the scene as to why we've selected this topic. So over the past year or so, we've seen an increase in the number of HR service cases relating to absence, and in particular, complex cases of long-term absence. Each case is unique, with even the smallest difference changing the outcome or decision-making process. Most HR issues require good judgment, and managing absences is no different. We want to equip you with the knowledge and skills to increase your confidence when using that judgment. Having a robust absence management policy is one of the most helpful tools an organisation can have, and we'll talk more about this later in the session. If you don't currently have one, we'll send out a template example along with the slides from today's presentation. We're going to move on now to look at the basics of absence management, including employment law, basic process, and the most important things for employers to remember. So first of all, just some basic statistics that you're likely already aware of, but for some things to highlight to you as well. The first one is what is long term, and it's something that we would consider as an ongoing absence of anything more than 4 weeks. Currently, SSP, statutory sick pay, is £116.75 per week for up to 28 weeks. And SSP is paid to employees and some workers from the 4th day of absence. So there's a 3-day waiting period before employees would be entitled to receive SSP. Now, I've mentioned some workers there, which I'll just highlight as the different types of employment status. So we have employee, worker, and freelancer. Now, we know that freelancers are not entitled to SSP because they're not employed directly by the organisation. Employees and workers are, but workers tend to have more irregular hours. They might be term time workers or sessional workers or 0 hours workers. And this means that they may not work regular hours where they have where they would qualify for that 3-day working period or waiting period. So they have those regular hours where they've worked, where they would usually work, but they're off sick. That to a sessional worker or a 0 hours worker might be spread over a number of weeks, and therefore they would be unlikely to qualify for an SSP payment. The next point there is SSP is included in contractual sick pay. And I highlight this because whenever we review absence management policies in the HR service, it's always something that I notice that it isn't made clear that SSP runs alongside contractual sick pay if contractual sick pay is offered. And so I think it's understandable and reasonable that an employee may expect that if, for example, they have 12 weeks full pay and 12 weeks half pay, equaling 24 weeks, that they might expect that they then have 28 weeks of SSP to use, whereas they would have actually used 24 weeks of their SSP and would have 4 weeks remaining. So I think that's an important one to be quite clear about in policies so that employees aren't confused. A couple of other responsibilities to mention in our basics section of today. And we'll talk about each of these in more detail as the session goes along. But the first one is maintaining records. So this is always one that I think is important for any HR issue, but maintaining a paper trail of all decisions, any discussions that you've had with people who are off sick, to make sure that if something becomes more formal, if you need to follow a more formal process down the line, you already have a paper trail, you already have documentation that you have to look back on and refer to. Communication, this is about communicating with staff who are off sick, when to do so, when not to do so. Also communicating with the staff who are still at work, who may be having to take on extra work during that period of absence. Reasonable adjustments, again, we'll talk about all of these in more detail, but as a bullet point, reasonable adjustments are a very important part of having someone be brought back to work after an absence to discuss, you know, do we want to reduce your hours temporarily, reduce your responsibilities? Are there physical things that we can change and help with? And that also goes hand in hand with an occupational health referral or a GP's letter. To get a professional, medical professional's advice as to the capability of this employee to do their contracted role. Are there things that we can change or that we can do to help as an employer in helping them back to work? A big one here is supportive managers. I think that absolutely it's fair for us as organisations to be concerned about, you know, ongoing productivity and operations within the organisation when someone is on long-term sick, especially in much smaller teams. But it's very important to be supportive towards that person who's off sick and doing all we can to make sure that their well-being is looked after, that we're doing all we can as an organisation to support them while they're off and coming back into work as well. And finally, is a big one in avoiding discrimination. So with the Equalities Act 2010, there is a group of protected characteristics. That includes disabilities, that includes gender, that includes sex and various other things. But when it comes to combining that with people who are off sick, there are, you know, different considerations to be made when there is a disability or when there is, for example, if someone is pregnant. If someone is absent in relation to those, the decisions that we make and the processes that we follow, which will be discussed more shortly, do need to be adapted somewhat. So I'm going to move on and pass over to Caroline now to talk about implementing the policy. Caroline.
Okay, thank you. So so I'm going to cover how to manage an absence process, which can also be known as a capability process. And I'll cover a formal process based on the ACAS guidance. So next slide, please, Orna. So before we delve deeper into the process, I wanted to cover a couple of overarching points that I think are important to consider. So firstly, your absence policy should set out a process for line managers to follow consistently when somebody is off sick. The policy should be used as a blueprint and provide clarity and consistency for the employee, as well as for you as a person managing the absence issue. And this will also ensure that any legal obligations are met if you have a clear policy set down in writing. So when managers feel confident with the process, It's much easier for you and for us to approach complex absence situations with strong judgment skills. So every case of long-term absence will be unique, and it's important to keep that in mind when making decisions as part of this process. Your policy should be applied fairly in all situations. That doesn't mean that it'll be applied in exactly the same way each time. So we'll go into that a bit more later. So let's have a look at what should be in the absence management policy, first of all. So that's on the next slide. Okay, so your absence management policy should set out the process to follow if you're off sick, who you report your absence to, by when, and how. It should also set out the process that you as managers will follow to manage frequent and short-term absences and also long-term absences, which is what I'm going to cover on the next slide, but not yet. So before I do that, just a reminder of what should be in your absence management policy. So that's what's on this slide here. So I'll focus on triggers. So it is useful to include triggers in your policy. There are no legal rules about how or when absence should be reviewed. It depends on what works for your organisation. Triggers for absence reviews are normally based on the number of absences a staff member has within a certain time period, the length of the absence, or it could be both. Triggers can help you to manage absence, to highlight when a staff member's absence levels may need your attention. So when someone's absence level reaches or goes over the trigger levels, normally this means you would meet with them informally to start a conversation about their attendance and a conversation about their well-being. But you would keep it informal at this stage. And this is the first instance that the triggers have been triggered. So let them know why you're having this informal conversation and let them know that their absence levels are higher than average. You could also use this informal conversation as an opportunity to discuss if there's any disability or long-term health condition that's contributing to their absence, and also highlight any support that you can offer. Okay, so we're focusing on long-term absences today, and your policy should include some information about what your employees can expect if they are unable to work longer term. So as Lorna said earlier, when we talk about long-term sickness, we're talking about sickness and absences of more than 4 weeks. Again, each long-term absence situation will be quite different, and you can flex your approach depending on the circumstances. For example, if someone is off sick for 3 months to recover from an operation, you probably wouldn't start a formal absence management process with them. You know why they're off and when they're likely to return. In this scenario, you would support their return to work, possibly with a phased return and other reasonable adjustments. So an informal conversation on the return to work or in the lead up to the return to discuss support might be everything that you need to do. If someone is off sick long term and you have no clear indication of when they will be well enough to return, if they've been signed off for 4 weeks and then signed off for another 4 weeks and then another 4 weeks, and you don't have any clear idea of when they're going to return, or if you have if somebody has several long-term absences throughout the year, this is when the formal absence management process can help. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So next slide, please, Lorna. Okay, so the aim of the absence management process is to support an improvement in attendance. However, the end point of the procedure could be redeployment or dismissal if there is no improvement. So these are pretty serious outcomes, so it is very important to follow a fair and clear process. If someone is off work on long-term sickness, meet with them informally first, as I mentioned earlier, to find out more about their reasons for their absence and to offer support. Always aim to understand the reasons or underlying reasons for the absence. So the slide we're on at the moment, this sets out a process that you could follow if the absence continues, becoming more long-term with no clear idea of when they're going to return, or again, if somebody has had several periods of long-term absence and has now returned to work. So the slide covers the process for a stage 1 absence review meeting. So I'll just talk through the slide. So the first step after you've had the informal meetings would be to invite your staff member to a formal review meeting, giving them some notice of the meeting. And we recommend at least 5 working days of notice, and also let them know that they can be joined by a trade union rep or a colleague. During the meeting, discuss the absence and aim to understand the reasons. Agree support measures and what improvement you need to see within an agreed review period. You could issue a warning or a caution following this meeting. This is not to punish your team member, it is to give them fair warning that if they're not able to return to work, or if they're not able to improve their attendance at work, they could be invited to a further formal meeting at stage 2, and that at the end point of this process that you've started, after you've done everything you can within reason to support their attendance, if there's still no improvement, the outcome could be that they're redeployed into a different role, possibly on different hours, or possibly dismissed. And importantly, your team member can appeal against this warning if they believe it's unfair. So you can manage attendance if someone has a disability and they're unable to attend work on a frequent basis, or they've been off long term. You have to be more flexible and make as many adjustments as possible within reason, and also take advice from occupational health. Absence related to disability or long-term health conditions should have extended triggers as a reasonable adjustment, and you can do that on a case-by-case basis. And you should also consider the disability and the symptoms when you're agreeing on the improvement, and also on the review period, and make sure that that's reasonable and fair. So just to summarise, the aim of this process is to understand more about the absence, to put support in place, to provide an opportunity to improve, and also to give fair warning of what could happen if no improvement is seen. So this can be a really complex area. If you subscribe to our HR service, we can support you with managing long-term absences. We can't do it for you, we can't hold the meetings for you, but we can advise you at each step of the process. Okay, so next slide, please.
Sorry, Odine has a good question. So
Yeah.
they've asked, what does taking advice from occupational health mean in practical terms?
Yes, so in practical terms, that's a really good question. So that means making a referral to occupational health. Most organisations in the voluntary sector don't have in-house occupational health, but there are external organisations that you can refer your staff members to. So you normally do that in writing, online, or in an email. And you can set out in your referral the questions that you want to know the answers to, and you can ask occupational health things like how likely is it that this absence is going to reoccur? How likely is it that they're going to be well enough to return in the next 6 months? And occupational health, they work with your staff member to answer those questions, and they can make recommendations. Recommendations that help your staff member, and recommendations that help you as an employer manage their return to work, or understand a bit more about their condition. So yeah, thank you for that question. Hopefully that's answered it. So the next slide, this is taken from the ACAS guide, and sets out the process for fairly dismissing someone for reasons including long-term absence. This is also the process that you'd follow if you were dismissing someone for conduct reasons. So we recommend an informal stage, first of all. If things don't improve, you'd move to stage 1 of this process. Moving on to stage 2, if no improvement is seen, and then stage 3, which is the final stage. And the possibility at this stage is that the outcome will be redeployment or dismissal if there's been no improvement. So obviously redeploying and dismissing someone are very big steps. So the next slide sets out some of the things you need to consider before you dismiss someone. So this is a stage 3 absence management meeting. So make sure that you have followed a stage process. It's not fair to meet with someone for the first time and follow out this redeployment or dismissal. You do need to follow a stage process and give them a chance to improve. Consider reasonable adjustments throughout the process. Consider redeployment. And if none of this changes anything and your team member is still unwell and off work, or they're still off work on a regular basis, get advice from occupational health before the stage 3 meeting. You really need to get a medical opinion about someone's health and well-being and ability to return to work before you make a dismissal decision. You also need to consider that advice, and you also need to consider what your staff member is telling you and make a decision based on all the information that you've gathered throughout the process. So I hope that's helpful. It's not a nice process for anyone involved. If someone's not well enough to work, it is really hard to manage. Your best options are to make adjustments if you can to enable the person to continue to work for you, but that's not always possible.
And Caroline, has been a good question that's came on from Dave. So is there a legal requirement for employers to agree to the employee being accompanied by a union rep? They would always do that, but he's also asked, can they be accompanied by a friend or family member?
Yeah, so there is a requirement for you need to let your team members know that they have the right to take a trade union rep or current colleague with them. That's their right. You can extend that to friends and family. That's your choice. Absolutely, that can be, if someone's quite unwell, it will be a difficult meeting for them. So if they have a friend or a family member there with them to support, then that's helpful. The one thing that I was told a long time ago is don't let anyone take an employment lawyer with them to these meetings, because that sort of changes the whole meeting. So yeah, so friends, family, trade union rep, current colleague, yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to pass back to Lorna now.
Thank you, Caroline. So I'm going to move on to talk in a bit more detail about some of the nuances that we might need to consider when managing complex absences. I've also thank you, Amy, for asking a few questions. I am seeing lots of good questions come in through the chat, and if we don't have time to cover any of those today, we are going to send a follow-up email that will answer all of those questions, and everyone will see those responses. So if you don't have a response within the webinar today, you will get one via email. So some nuances to consider, and I've mentioned a few of these already, but we'll talk about them in more detail now. So first of all is communication. It's a reasonable thing for employers to keep in touch with their colleagues who are off sick. It could be, if you know that this person will be off for some time, to agree with them at the very start how often you will contact them, how often they will contact you, how they wish to be contacted, and also how to communicate with the rest of the team who are in the organisation at the time. It could be that they don't want you to mention anything. They could give permission for you to talk about it openly, but also for how to manage the staff that are still in the organisation who may start to feel resentment. They might start to feel pressured with extra work that they have to be doing at the time. So thinking about communication. So we've mentioned occupational health assessments a couple of times. This might be something that you want to discuss with an employee, and it might seem scary for them, first of all, but it's important to remind them that it's not a punitive action in any way. It's about doing all you can to support them and make sure that they're able to be safe and well at work. If there are linked absences where they've been off several times for the same reason, you might want to find out more about how work affects their condition and what a health professional recommends to make changes. It can also be an important step to gain evidence that an employee is no longer medically capable of fulfilling their role before making the decision to dismiss due to ill health. Workplace adjustments are a standard part of the process and should always form part of a conversation about the employee coming back to work after an absence. They might not be needed, but you should always offer to discuss it if necessary. This could be temporarily reducing hours or responsibilities, or supporting the employee to make an application to Access to Work, which is a government scheme that helps people get equipment and support to feel safe at work. And in the email that we'll follow up with, I'll include all the links to things that we've mentioned today that you might want to find out more about. It's always important that workplace issues are managed legally and as per the policy that you have in place, and Caroline spoke about that earlier, but even more so when you have a complicated situation with lots of details that could be confusing or contradictory. The best way to manage it is always to deal in facts. Always refer back to your policy and reach out to us in the HR service if you have questions or want to work through your thinking. Now, the focus will naturally be on managing the process and checking in on the absent colleague, but don't forget about the staff who might be taking on extra responsibilities during that period of absence. In smaller teams and organisations, the risk of team dynamics taking a hit is high, where resentment grows when stress levels become unmanageable. It's important here to be as transparent as possible with your team. So like I mentioned with communication, that doesn't necessarily mean that we share all the details of why someone is off sick. But if they've given permission, you can share more with the team to help them understand what's going on. And finally, in some scenarios, it might be necessary to reevaluate organisational or team priorities if it becomes clear that objectives can no longer be met as a result of the absence. Rather than stress about it or put more pressure on staff, is it possible to delay things or reprioritise objectives temporarily? I also wanted to cover off some what-if questions. Now, these are questions that we see regularly in the HR service, and I think is worth covering today. So what if they run out of sick pay? So we need to make sure that the employee is kept up to date with everything relating to their pay while off sick. Always try to send a letter or email to confirm the dates of when sick pay will change or end ahead of time, and invite them to have a chat with you about their options. Now, this could include taking any available annual leave. This would mean that they would come off sick pay, off sick and go on annual leave, as you can't be off sick and on annual leave at the same time. They might be considering a return to work with flexible arrangements in place. So that could be staggered hours, reduced responsibilities, a phased return. And also make sure that they know where to go for further advice. So that could be your employment assistance program, if you have one, financial advice or a counselling service. Keep talking to them and remember to always document any decisions that are made. What if work is the reason for their absence? So if something has happened at work to cause an employee to go off sick, there are some steps that you can take to be supportive and try to solve the issue. First, if they want to and they feel able to, have a chat with them. Listen to them without judgment and seek to understand what's been going on. Complete a stress risk assessment with them if you feel and they feel that it would be helpful. This helps identify what their main stressors are at work and how to go about reducing them. You could then go on to create an action plan with them to help them be clear about how things will be when they get back to work. If they're off because of an interpersonal issue, let them know that they have some options to consider, including informally discussing it, mediation, or for more serious situations, submitting a grievance. Monitor the situation as it develops and make sure that the employee feels supported throughout. Now, what if they don't want you to keep in touch while they're off? In these situations, it's important to respect their choice if they don't want to be contacted while off sick. The first thing to do here is acknowledge their request and confirm that you understand that this is their choice. Be clear that should their circumstances change or they need to extend their leave, that they will inform you of this. At the very start of their leave, make sure that they've got all the information as to how to report any changes or how to get in touch. Confirm that you will only get in touch if absolutely necessary and document this agreement to avoid any miscommunications. Finally, make sure they know that you're there to support them if and when they need it, and the details of your employee assistance programme if you have one. And finally, what if they don't give consent for a medical referral? So an occupational health assessment or report from the employee's GP can be helpful in supporting them back to work, but they do have to give consent for this to happen. It's a good idea to make a few attempts to get their consent, but if they refuse, ultimately, you should explain to them that any further decisions relating to their absence will be based on the information that you have available. Now, another thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is proportionality. What do I mean by that? Simply, it's about taking all circumstances into account before making a decision. This is relevant for disciplinaries, grievances, and performance issues as well. In an absence scenario, it might be thinking about an employee's history of absence or their length of service. It could be about your awareness of a disability or long-term condition or something going on in their personal lives. You might have two very similar situations, but one detail in one case means that you take a completely different action. Providing that you're still following the procedure and that you apply consistency across all instances, it's within your gift to take action that you feel is most appropriate. I've written up a couple of examples in the next slide, which I'll read through and then describe how I would advise an organisation proceed. These are completely made up case studies. I'll read through them and then we'll go through how I would advise in the HR service. So example 1. An employee has been working with you for 18 months. During that time, they've had 8 periods of absence, all seemingly unlinked and varying in length from 1 day to 2 weeks. In total, they've had 48 days off since they started, and several days have been unauthorised, so the employee has a first written warning. During this most recent period of absence, they've been off for 21 days and have not made any indication of an imminent return, nor have they answered your calls to check in. They don't have any disclosed disabilities or long-term conditions, and the reason that they've given for being off is stress at home. In example 2, an employee has 15 years service. In the past 12 months, they've been off sick several times, totaling 18 days away from work. Previous to this, there were no issues with their attendance, but they've been given a written warning recently due to increased absence levels. They've now handed in a sick line for 4 weeks, stating that they have a back injury. There have been 1 or 2 previous absences giving the same reason, and they've recently contacted you to disclose that they've been diagnosed with chronic back pain due to a slipped disc. So both of these are examples of long-term absence with loosely similar circumstances, but the way I'd advise organisations on them are quite different. So there are a few things to consider here first. First is their length of service. Example 1 is a relatively new employee with 18 months service, whereas with example 2, they have 15 years service. That has to come into consideration when deciding what actions to take. Now, both examples have a live written warning, but example 1 has this because of unauthorised absences, where they haven't followed a correct reporting procedure. Example 2 also has a warning, but this is because they reached a trigger point with increased absences. And this was just because it was what the policy said to do. So it may have been a line manager who was with every intention trying to be consistent with the policy, but not having necessarily taken in all circumstances before making that decision to issue a warning. So thinking about all of that, here is what I would advise. In example 1, I think one of the most key points here is to note that the reason that they've given for being off is stress at home. So it's important to really try and get in contact with that person to make sure that their well-being is being looked after, that they're okay, and that what we can do as their employer to support if there is stress at home. Now, obviously, several attempts to contact them have already been made. And so Taking into consideration the processes that Caroline spoke about earlier, we haven't been able to contact them on the phone, so send a letter to invite them to one of those meetings to discuss next steps and how to potentially support them back into work. If they don't respond to the letter, maybe send another letter, but as a recorded mail, so that you know that they've received the note, and again, invite them along to a meeting. But I think in what I've mentioned there about proportionality, with the person having less than 2 years service, when it comes to employment law, there is less risk of the employer to receive a claim of unfair dismissal from someone that has been dismissed due to absence. How, we're going to talk about employment law changes shortly, where this may change. But it's definitely something to take into consideration while still applying consistency and fairness before making that decision to dismiss. Now, employee 2, while the employee has a lot of absence in the past year, we have to consider that they've previously had no issues and they all seem to be linked to this new diagnosis. Where in example 1, I've been quicker to reach the decision to dismiss potentially, I have to be proportionate here in considering their length of service, the circumstances of their written warning, and the reason for their absences. In this scenario, I'd simply confirm the period of absence with the employee, state that I will check in every week or differently if they want something different, and when they're ready, have a meeting to discuss the next steps. Those steps would generally be agreeing reasonable adjustments, potentially attending an occupational health assessment meeting, and agreeing a staggered or a phased return to work. We might also have to consider redeployment if their condition stops them from doing their contracted role, or in the worst case scenario, decide to dismiss through capability if we're unable to offer a different role. So it's just a couple of case studies there to bring to life everything that we've discussed so far, and hopefully that's been helpful to help in thinking about the practical steps to take when dealing with these complex issues. Now, moving into responding to absence issues, and I wanted to split these up into both proactive and reactive measures that we can take. Both of these are useful and can, in combination, can really help towards maintaining low levels of absence. So let's take a look at those. First is proactive, so promoting a healthy working environment. Do staff have clear health and safety measures when completing manual labour? Do they have a safe, ergonomic setup to work from a desk? Do you promote a healthy work-life balance? Do staff have a clear platform to share ideas and concerns? Mental health support. So do you have mental health first aiders or know how to go about doing this and setting it up? Is there an employee assistance programme they can contact? Or do you know of signposts for good places to go to without an employee assistance programme? Is there a positive working culture where staff feel happy, safe and valued? Is mental health something that is talked about openly at work? Then on to flexible working. Flexible working is now available to all employees from their first day of employment. Is this something that we can promote as an option to all staff? Is flexi time also an option where staff can flex their hours during the day to attend medical appointments or take a longer lunch hour to go for a walk? I know this isn't always possible, but it can make a huge difference. And then clear policies. Having clear procedures in place to follow provides certainty for employees, and they'll always know what to expect. Clear boundaries are a good thing. Moving into the reactive approaches. So return to work interviews. These are interviews to understand the reasons why someone was absent from work and offer support for a smooth return. This is mainly about making sure that they're well enough to return to work, and also gives you the opportunity to identify any adjustments that need to be made to prevent future absences. Now, I've advised a few organisations on this and would always say that return to work meetings should happen after each and every absence. I've heard a couple of organisations say they only do this after long-term absences or after a set amount of days. But going right back to the beginning and talking about keeping a paper trail and documenting everything, Having this for each and every period of absence will be helpful should you have to move into a more formal process in the future. Then we're looking at monitoring absence patterns, keeping track of absence data to identify trends and address underlying issues. Are there particular days of the week, for example, where absences are higher? And we can use this data to inform proactive health and wellness strategies. And documenting this through the return to work meeting is a good start. Providing support during absence, so staying in touch with employees who are off sick to offer support and updates. Unless they've told you otherwise, like we've discussed, it's important to keep staff on long-term sick up to date with important things that are happening at work. This ensures that they feel valued and connected to the workplace. And finally, adjusting workloads, temporarily redistributing work to prevent overburdening, other employees. Ensuring that returning employees are not overwhelmed with tasks. And in smaller organizations, it's inevitable that having someone off sick will put more pressure on the rest of the team. Being transparent about that and understanding that things might be tougher for a short period will go a long way to making the staff feel heard. If it's needed, you could reassess organizational priorities. Can anything be delayed, for example, to lighten the load a little bit? Very much a whistle-stop tour of some measures that we can take. But again, if you are subscribed to the HR service, please feel free to get in touch with us to ask more questions about that, for us to expand on any of those points, if you are considering thinking about strategies for reducing absences in your organisation. So that really brings us to a close of the absence portion of this webinar. I recognise that I'm sure there will be many questions that are coming through. So I'm going to pass now to Caroline to cover our employment law update section. And with what time we have left at the end of that, we will cover your questions. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. Thanks, Orna. So I'll cover this quite quickly. And we are going to follow up in writing about all these changes. So we'll send you a document that lists all the changes. So a very recent change is the responsibility for employers to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace has increased. So employers now have to actively prevent sexual harassment at work. The Equality and Human Rights Commission have put together a really helpful 8-step guide. Our HR service also has a guide which is available to subscribers and members of SCVO. We'll also share this in an email following this session. So I'm just going to cover this quite quickly. So the 8 steps really are to have a policy, to engage your staff so they understand what sexual harassment is, so they understand how to report it, and they understand what to do if they witness it. A big part of the new responsibility is to carry out a risk assessment. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission, they recognise that every workplace is different, and some workplaces will have a lot more risk involved. So maybe not so much in our sector, but bars and nightclubs, events where alcohol is involved, there's going to be a higher risk. So yeah, the guidance recognises that each organisation will have a different level of risk, and that office-based environments should hopefully be a lower risk. So yes, carry out the risk assessment, and we can provide a template for that as well. The other steps are to have a clear reporting process, to train your staff, and to really make sure that everyone understands what sexual harassment is and what to do if they witness it. So that was really quick. Sorry, it is really important, but I'm just rushing through it because we do have all this in writing that we can share with you after. Okay, so a quick run through of some of the changes that the new Employment Rights Bill will introduce. So these won't come into law until autumn 2026, probably at the earliest. So steps you can take now to prepare for this is to review your policies and start thinking about updating them in the lead up to autumn 2026. So the main changes are, from 2026, paternity leave and parental leave will become a day one right. Currently, you have to have 26 weeks service before you can access this type of leave. A day one right to bereavement leave will be introduced. Bereavement leave is currently available to parents that have lost a child, and this right to bereavement leave is going to be extended to other bereavement situations. Women returning from maternity leave, it will be unlawful to dismiss someone returning from maternity leave within the first 6 months of their return. And the qualifying period for unfair dismissal will be removed and replaced with a new statutory probationary period for your new starters. And the probationary period is likely to be 9 months. Flexible working changes that are coming mean that if you're an employer turning down a flexible working request, you have to ensure that you've followed a fair process and that the reason for you turning down the request is reasonable. There'll be more guidance about this nearer the time, but rather than flexible working by default, which was something that was spoken about before the bill was clarified, it is really more about introducing a presumption in favour of flexible working, which is a phrase employment lawyers are using. Okay, so removal of the lower earnings limit and removal of the 3-day waiting period before statutory sick pay kicks in. So that means that more people will be entitled to statutory sick pay. And finally, employers that use 0-hour contracts will really have to think about how they use those and if they are necessary. So workers on 0 hours contracts that are actually working regular hours, employers will have to offer them guaranteed hours based on what they've worked over what's likely to be a 12-week reference period. Okay, so we have 10 minutes and we can try our best to answer your questions about anything that we've just covered.
Thanks, Caroline. I've just I may as well just mention it in the here. But there was a very good question, a very good observation about the examples that I mentioned earlier. Of sort of reaching that decision to dismiss someone when they've mentioned that they have stress at home. Kind of comments sort of saying, you know, what sort of practical support can employers take? For example, one, it seems a bit draconian to reach that decision to dismiss. Could we offer counselling? It seems a bit harsh to dismiss. And what I've mentioned in the chat is I completely agree with all of that, and that's why at the very beginning I mentioned that they've said there's stress at home. So we want to make sure that we've done all we can to reach out to them and see what support we can come up with. And maybe something extra that we can do is when we're sending out those letters or emails in the attempts to contact them is to lay out what support we can offer so that they can see it up front. So if we can offer counselling, we can offer things that, you know, as part of an employee assistance programme or other things, write it in there before they've even spoken to you. But where I've come to the decision to dismiss is that we have made several attempts to contact them with no response, whereas essentially that becomes, okay, well, we have to presume that they've now resigned. Where we haven't heard from them. We've made those attempts. We've done it 2, 3, 4 times with nothing back. So that's where I've come to that decision. But I totally agree with you that we need to take all those steps before we come to that fair decision to dismiss them. Please also feel free to put your hands up in the chat if you want to unmute and ask your question to us, but I'll also scroll through the questions. Oh, Alan, you've put your hand up. Please unmute and ask your question.
I actually put my question in the chat as well, but I'll just ask it since I've got the chance. Might be quite a silly question, but I'm quite new to being an employer. Statutory sick pay. Could you just outline very briefly how it works in practice? And especially now that I'm seeing that the the employment rights bill is going to come through and remove the sort of 3-day wait period. As an employer, what do I do in that circumstance? The statutory sick pay, I assume it's it's a small proportion of their salary. Do I just notify my payroll and say my employee's off sick? Please move them to statutory sick pay, or what do I do?
Caroline, do you want to answer that question from a practical sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so first of all, you check if they're eligible for statutory sick pay. So there's clear guidance on the gov.uk website about the eligibility. So it is, if they're earning less than the statutory sick pay amount, then they may not be eligible, or they might be eligible for a different amount. So yeah, there's clear guidance there, and we can share that link with you. So most people will be entitled to SSP. So there is a set amount. It was on one of the earlier slides. It's £116 a week. If they're, so that's the weekly amount, the weekly rate that they will receive, and it is a case of advising your payroll the first date of their absence. So when their statutory sick pay would start, they'll be able to advise you on that anyway. But so yeah, you'd let them know their first day of absence. From that, they'll work out when their SSP kicks in, which is after 3 days. So on the 4th day of absence, you start getting paid statutory sick pay. And then you just need to remember to tell them when they're back at work, so they know to stop the statutory sick pay. If someone does continue to be off sick longer term and they're reaching the end of their statutory sick pay, it's good practice to write to them to let them know that their pay will soon come to an end. Okay.
Thanks, Caroline. Just to extend on that, Kate Griffin asked a great question of what pay do people get when on a phased return? Just the hours they work, or full pay as they are back at work?
Yeah, so we in our own policy at SCVO, we normally record the time off during the phased return as sickness. We record that as a type of sickness related to the phased return. So we don't include that time off in any triggers or anything. But yeah, we include that as a type of absence. So if they do still have SSP or organisational sick pay, they get paid for it. I know that some organisations, and this is something that you could agree with your employee, it's not something you could enforce without their agreement. If they've been off sick for a long time, they're likely to have they'll have been accruing their annual leave. So you could agree that some of that time is taken as annual leave. Or you could prorate it, so you could pay them for the time they work, and the time that they're not working is unpaid. But I would consider sick pay or annual leave first before not paying them for that time.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes, so we're going to cover a couple more questions, and there are a lot of questions in the chat. Sue, I think you had your hand up. If you have a question, please feel free.
You answered it. I was asking, I wanted to know about this phased return and the sick pay, so you answered it.
Excellent. Thanks, Sue. There's an interesting one here from Tony. Does someone remain as an employee once SSP 28 weeks is over? Are they just an unpaid member of staff until they return? So yes, they are still an employee, and we would communicate with them that SSP is due to end, and it would then move on to unpaid leave or unpaid sick leave. Again, as Caroline said, we would maybe discuss with them if they have any outstanding annual leave. They could maybe use that. But as I said at the very start, they would no longer be on sick leave during that period. We could also, what we'd also be looking at is, are we following that absence management procedure during that time? 28 weeks is a long time. So during that time, of course, according to the circumstances of why they are off, are we following that procedure to make sure that the reasons for absence are covered, that we're providing all the support we can. But yes, once that 28 weeks is exhausted, they will still be an employee of the organisation.
And they continue to accrue annual leave. That's other thing, their statutory annual leave.
I don't think there are any other hands up. There are still plenty of questions that we haven't got to in the chat, and I do apologise that we haven't covered them in the time of the webinar, but we are on 10:59 and I don't want to take up more of your time than we've said that we will. So I'm going to conclude everything. I really hope that you have gotten a lot out of today and that you found it helpful. As I've said, we're going to follow up with an email that will include all the answers to the questions that you've asked today. The presentation will be included in that email, as well as any links that we've talked about today that might be helpful for you to read more about. We'll also have an evaluation form for you to complete to let us know what you thought of today's session, and just give us a bit of an idea as to how to move forward with future webinars from the HR service. So that's it from